Nothing we've said so far should be interpreted as us believing there is nothing of value with Hop and Hoppianism. To me, no set of ideas, save nihilism, is 100% wrong. Hop's critique of Thomas Hobbes' state of nature is gorgeous in its brutality. Plus, he has a good analysis of time preferences of democratic rulers, and his explanation of demographic hostility as a result of state-enforced proximity is accurate. However, our purpose was to explore how Hop approaches libertarianism and explain in detail its conflicts with libertarian principles.
I would disagree fundamentally with the notion that it's impossible, in regards to philosophy, to be 100% wrong or right about any subject one talks about, given that philosophies are just various claims of truth about subjects relating to nature. It obviously is conceivably possible to be 100% correct or incorrect about one's assessment of reality, though there are many factors which render a complete understanding unknowable, at least by modern standards. Before I'm accused of making some sort of world of forms argument, know that I distinguish between subjects which inherent in whatever claims put forward from any particular school of thought on the subject are something which universally has to be applied to the world as we can observe, i.e., claims about biology, mathematics, social organization, ethics, action, etc., and subjects where claims of truth can be made but are either dependent upon preferences or context using one of the formerly noted subjects to even be coherent. So, one of the reasons that universal objective truth can't be known, as is because it would be incoherent in the vast majority of subjects to even claim that truth exists beyond a relative perception, because what can be true is limited to only a certain framing of discussion. In other words, there'd be no way to demonstrate that red is a better color of a shirt than blue, but you can claim that red appeals to certain personality types more so than blue. But I digress, because this subject can get pretty meta and would require a whole essay in and of itself for me to even come close to doing it a justice. My point in bringing this up is that a very common misconception many people have about Heretic and I, especially from the Hoppe crowd whom this essay is directed towards, is that we just, for whatever reason, have some sort of vendetta against Hoppe, which motivates us to try and defame him and misrepresent his work to justify our case against him. Well, first of all, nowhere in any of our arguments in this essay have we misrepresented any of Hoppe's positions, or arguments for said positions. In fact, we directly link to the works we reference down to the page number for the material we're citing. If anything, I would say we did our best to steelman his positions, given how, in the way they were proposed, they're barely coherent. Though if you think we have, please, go ahead and point out to us specifically where, and we may correct our position. Keep in mind, though, that testing your proposition's axiomatic consistency by applying the reasoning used to support it in a scenario that demonstrates it to be inconsistent, and either using equivocation or question begging to try and worm your way around our criticisms won't suffice to demonstrate an example of how we've supposedly distorted Hoppe's arguments. But my initial take on Hoppe's work back when I first started my intellectual journey was honestly just that I assumed the people using his positions to justify slavery, feudalism, and all sorts of various absurdities, state constructs, or state aggression, under the guise that they were all compatible with libertarianism or the Austrian method of analysis, were just misrepresenting his arguments, and I was perfectly willing to accept Hoppe's work into the Austro-libertarian canon. Then I read it. Then I read more of his work to do research for this essay.
My interpretation of Hoppe begins with argumentation ethics. He starts at the principle of self-ownership, in contrast with the Aristotelian deontological approach of recognizing natural rights as a spontaneous phenomenon that results from free association. Hoppe identifies that arguing against self-ownership is a performative contradiction and is therefore invalid. While it is true that arguing against self-ownership is a contradictory statement, like saying, "I am not speaking English," the framework of argumentation ethics cannot make this observation. Not only is recognizing the bodily integrity of whom they are speaking not a prerequisite for argumentation, but the conflation of liberty rights and claim rights creates unfortunate implications. For example, one's self-ownership is assumed to be dependent on one's ability for argumentation, in which case low-functioning autistic people, infants, the mute, or even sleeping people lack self-ownership, or even it necessitates a claim to land on which to stand to make an argument, as well as a claim to food and water of which one needs to live. As such, argumentation ethics necessarily needs to make a positive claim of someone else's property to remain consistent, in addition to being able to deprive people of their rights if they cannot make arguments. All to solve a non-existent problem. Natural law refuted Hume's guillotine literally centuries ago. It has no use for libertarianism.
Needless to say, I was wrong in my initial assumptions. He was not being misrepresented, and because of that, there is no rational case to be made by anyone under any standards that he could be considered a part of the Austro-libertarian canon. Something I came across after we'd finished up the other 5 parts of the essay, and I cannot believe that Heretic and I missed this in hindsight, is that for those of you who weren't aware, you all knew that Hoppe was a tenured professor long before he'd proposed argumentation ethics. However, I bet that significantly fewer of you were aware of who Hoppe obtained his PhD under, a man named Jürgen Habermas. Now, Habermas is actually a world-renowned intellectual, but not for anything that a libertarian would find admirable. He's mostly known for his work in the study of German idealism, which Teal Deer is basically just a series of philosophies which attempt to rationalize Plato's world of forms within the modern sciences. This, in and of itself, doesn't make Habermas's relationship with Hoppe suspect. After all, Rothbard had a PhD from Columbia University, and American academia in regards to economic study is just an orgy of Marxists and Keynesians. What makes Habermas's relationship suspect, though, is a concept that he introduced to ethical philosophy he refers to as discourse ethics. Yes, Habermas is still alive, though based on our work speed as of late, by the time you're actually watching this, that may not be the case. But anyway, from the name discourse ethics alone, you may be able to infer that it shares more than a few similarities with Hoppe's argumentation ethics. In fact, discourse and argumentation are direct synonyms, so in effect these concepts even share a name. But what I bet you weren't expecting was for argumentation ethics to literally be the same concept, verbatim, but with a different label slapped onto it. So if you've seen part 1 of this essay, the chapter on argumentation ethics, one of my main criticisms of the concept was that the conclusion did not naturally follow from the argument used to reach it, specifically because it makes no distinction between liberty rights and claim rights. In other words, arguing that one has a right to speech, for instance, is treated with no distinction to arguing that one has an entitlement to someone else's labor to provide them with resources, meaning that on top of the fact that there isn't really a coherent idea of ethics being articulated at all, you could also feasibly use argumentation ethics to argue in favor of actions which directly conflict with the libertarian's claim about the nature of society. Well, as it turns out, in its original proposition as discourse ethics, the concept was used specifically for the purpose of attempting to provide an ethical basis for state socialism.
But wait! There's more!
Discourse ethics is rooted in another theory introduced by Habermas titled communicative rationality, which is the concept of discourse ethics but applied to social interactions and communications as a way of attempting to explain how meaning is conveyed. This is rooted in a study, not a theory, but a unique methodology itself to sociology known as universal pragmatics, which makes the claim that social conflicts exist because of failed attempts between different people to communicate properly, whatever that means. And people fail to communicate properly largely because of people having varying views on conventions in society due to varying access to resources. You may be able to draw even more parallels from communicative rationality and universal pragmatics to other concepts which have been introduced to the libertarian movement by Hoppe, or can see how said concepts introduced by Hoppe were derived from these two positions. But do you want to know the really amusing part? Well, I'd imagine that when I was explaining what universal pragmatics is, that quite a few of you in the audience were scratching your head because it sounds strangely familiar, but you just couldn't put your finger on where you've heard it before. Well, maybe if I were to paraphrase one of the more popular arguments based around universal pragmatics, that may jog your noggin a little bit. Capitalism is inherently racist towards black people because more white people own means of production, and white people have different interests than black people. Yep. Universal pragmatics, which is the basis of discourse ethics, also known as argumentation ethics, is not just based on, but is central to Marxist critical theory. Now, I may talk in depth about critical theory at a later point depending on whether or not you guys want me to, because I haven't thus far. But the reason that I thought this was interesting to mention is, first of all, this has absolutely hilarious implications for any conception of a political spectrum. But my favorites are that Marxists have pointed to Hoppe's arguments and social positions for the longest time, and used him more or less as the basis for pulling a fallacy of composition and arguing that Austro-libertarianism is fascist, neo-feudalist, etc. Well, the basis of Hoppeanism is rooted in a Marxist attempt to expand upon the material dialectic, so it sounds like quite a few people have some soul-searching to do. Likewise with Hoppeans, since argumentation ethics is literally just Marxism with the label of libertarian property rights theory slapped onto it, it's even more amusing to actual Rothbardians such as Heretic and I to see Hoppeans attempt to brand us as Marxist subversives who have anti-property views for pointing out that Hoppe's philosophy is nonsense on stilts. What this means for Hoppe's intentions in the libertarian movement, I'll leave to your imagination. But one thing is for goddamn sure. We can say with absolute certainty that this is not a person who looked at Rothbard's work or the work of any other libertarian intellectual who's contributed significant ideas that help us better understand the nature of political authority and state society, then thought to himself, I agree with all this, and this definitely is the basis of my worldview, but it's not complete. Here's something I thought of which would make it more complete, and from there gave us argumentation ethics, his contract theory, his views on feudalism and the natural aristocracy, secessionism, etc.
Everything else in Hoppeanism exists in service to the creation of his ideal anarchist social order he calls the natural order. A natural order is, if you recall, Hoppe's concept of the state of nature and how he believes moral agents, absent aggression and coercion from a state, would organize. Its organization is quasi-feudalist, in which individuals are obligated to each other based on feudalist hierarchies and kinship relations, with hereditary dynasties of arbitrators at the top of the totem pole. The patriarchs of said arbitration dynasties placed, due to winning the genetics lottery of their ancestors, demonstrated affinity for wisdom and fairness in arbitrating disputes, as opposed to, their own. While Hoppe was not the first one to use the terms natural order, he is the first to structure it in this way. Hoppe believes people will voluntarily forfeit their property to the proprietor of these feudalist non-state states. Although it makes little business sense to do so, these covenant communities, for the purpose of maintaining an anarchist social order, will be extremely restrictive in what behavior they allow, will impose cultural norms rather than allow them to arise spontaneously, and will actively use violence against peaceful people for being arbitrarily defined bad neighbors. The proprietarian property ethics of Hoppe permits the use of property rights in a predatory or even violent manner, like property encirclement. Natural rights libertarians have no issue addressing encirclement, but the paleo-libertarian framework necessitates bending their own philosophy into pretzels in order to come up with solutions for the encirclement problem, such as with selling access rights back to people whose property was encircled, as though it were perfectly ethical to sell people back the rights that were stolen from them. Here's the truth. They're acts of aggression. The man demanding you to let go of their flagpole and fall to your death is committing an act of aggression. But, more importantly, a proprietary society in which all land is owned by one guy, which arbitrators are or are not allowed to operate there based on the discretion of the proprietor. But, more importantly, a proprietary society in which all land is owned by one guy, is able to decide which arbitrators are or are not allowed to operate there based on their discretion, enabling them to create a monopoly on arbitration, ran by either the proprietor themselves or their agents, all while being 100% completely consistent with Hoppian property ethics. Creating a government so we can maintain a society without a government. How Hoppe believes governments arose from whence there was no government makes perfect sense. He simply took his own ideas about a stateless society to their logical conclusion. Now, the next question. How do we abolish the state? According to Hoppe, engage in the political process. If we just get people to vote hard enough, they'll create more smaller governments around the world. More smaller governments mean governments will have to compete with each other to attract taxpayers, resulting in decentralization, and they will become less oppressive as a result. Except when government competition is reductive and results in more centralization, making governments more oppressive. To Hoppe, both points are true simultaneously, all to create the natural order I mentioned earlier. The closest time in history to a natural order was, according to Hoppe, during European feudalism, even though feudalism and those arrangements were so diverse across regions and time periods that simplifying as it being like X or like Y is doomed to fail. Furthermore, the natural order is, according to Hoppe, compatible with serfdom, as in literal slavery. Hoppe claims to be an anarchist, yet when internalized by libertarians, his framework for understanding social relationships, history, economics, and ethics actively prevents libertarians from being able to refute political rule consistently. In fact, they unironically argue in favor of political power quite frequently. I want to give Hoppe the benefit of the doubt, but his arguments are consistent with that of a government agent sent to infiltrate and undermine libertarianism by reintroducing statist premises like structuralism, political action, neo-feudalism, and the culture war into the libertarian intellectual canon and reframing them as libertarian, creating subversive narratives disguised as a methodology for solving flaws or inconsistencies in libertarianism that don't actually exist. If this is the case, then I applaud him for his methodology and subtlety. But does this mean Hoppe is a government agent? Well, there's no proof at all, don't be silly. But if it did turn out that he was a Five Eyes intelligence asset or on the Rothschilds' payroll or anything else, I would not be surprised. I want to say Hoppe is arguing good faith, but I just don't know. What I can say with absolute certainty is that what Hoppe is putting forward is not libertarianism, let alone anarchism. That the subversion to libertarianism called Hoppianism has been unopposed by libertarians for so long is criminal. It is claimed Hoppe is a deontologist, but in his argument against state rule, his appeals to natural law are non-existent. His opposition to democracy is based on the consequences of it rather than the injustice inherent in political rule or the inability of those who use political power to make a coherent and logically consistent truth claim defending it. All the while, he directly advocates for political means to achieve apolitical ends in what must be done in libertarianism done right. Any deontologist would recognize the performative contradiction in seeking political power for anti-political purposes, as well as the moral hazards such a person exposes themselves to. Appointing politicians to end politics, bureaucrats to end bureaucracy, or police to end policing entangles one's own interests in the existence of politicians, bureaucrats, and police. Natural law makes impossible justifying violence against peaceful people, period. This does not change because they are bad neighbors. Yet getting libertarianism right recommends doing this very thing, and in Democracy the God That Failed, he overtly recommends enslaving and killing people ignorant of division of labor, without even so much as a passing reference to how this is consistent or inconsistent with Hoppe's own claims about self-ownership in argumentation ethics. let alone natural law. I was understanding that the prerequisite for self-ownership was one's ability for argumentation, not one's understanding of division of labor. Storytellers need beta readers to help them see their work from an outside perspective, as things that make perfect sense in their minds since they develop their characters, setting, story, aren't always properly communicated to the audience. Our critique has not always had the most flattering tone, but if Professor Hoppe did watch this all the way through, this essay should help him take a step back and re-examine his own narratives to help his brand of anarcho-capitalism properly communicate his ideas and principles, as he has become too close to it. If I may be so bold, here are some suggestions. 1. Return to natural law. Argumentation ethics is an ethical philosophy originally designed by the Frankfurt School to justify claim rights against other people's property. Argumentation being the means by which rights are established, meaning one has a claim to food, shelter, and healthcare to be able to make an argument at all. And this doesn't change just because you call yourself a libertarian when you articulate the same arguments. Reframing it as a proof of self-ownership fails to disprove the claim rights to other people's property argumentation ethics, or as we should call it, discourse ethics, implies. All of this to solve a problem in libertarianism that never existed in the first place. The is-ought problem was defeated a long time ago, as deontological ethics emerge spontaneously in a free society in which people want to have their disputes resolved fairly, which we can all agree will be in every society. Nobody wants to be treated unfairly, after all. Natural law makes no oughts, as it's a value-free observation of interpersonal relationships and justice, not a normative Kantian claim. In libertarians' ongoing search for consistency, we need to leave argumentation ethics behind. It was formulated to reinforce natural law, it's true, but not once. Not once does Hoppe even attempt to describe his understanding of natural law. The moment he stated that economically ignorant people ought to be hunted down or enslaved should have been the first clue he does not understand natural law. The fact that Hoppians can argue that rights don't begin at birth, that hatchlings are the property of their parents, Hoppe himself being in support of hitting hatchlings, being yet another example how arbitrarily and unilaterally defined his and his followers' conception of rights actually are. Even expressing certain beliefs invalidates your rights, apparently. Number 2. Overthrow the natural aristocracy. The idea that leaders and people with good judgment will emerge spontaneously in any group of people, including in a stateless one, is completely reasonable. However, the assumption that these same traits of leadership, wisdom, and sound judgment will be inherent in the kids and thus create dynasties of arbitrators just does not follow, unless one wants to argue for genetic determinism or enslaving the next generation to the occupations of their forebears. Sure, parents can teach their kids the family trait of arbitration, and sometimes judges' kids make excellent judges, of course. But this won't always be the case, and modeling social organization in anticipation of the second coming of the Habsburgs, with inbreeding and all, identifies the concept of the natural aristocracy as a secularization of the divine right of kings theory, that certain moral agents are, naturally, chosen to have special rights that nobody else has as a result of the perception of sound judgment and fairness they may or may not actually have. Their serfs have no rights whatsoever and are compelled to not only obey the judgments of Hoppe's philosopher kings, but the will of the community that allegedly appointed them. Much like the divine right of kings, the natural aristocracy thus only has legitimacy insofar as people believe in the mythology of a supernatural entity, either God or the collective, appointing their chosen one, as their special power cannot otherwise be logically or consistently demonstrated, thus making them logically invalid. But organizing society around these secular god kings inevitably leads to Number 3. Social centralization. In Democracy, the God That Failed, Hoppe clearly spells out that only conservative, traditionalist, natural values, in other words Hoppe's own personal values, are capable of maintaining an anarchist social order, and any deviations from this must be opposed with aggression and even with dehumanization and murder. In order to achieve this, society must centralize around covenant communities in which all social services traditionally provided by governments are instead provided by, and all properties owned by, the proprietor of the community who demands conformity and obedience to a set of cultural norms imposed from the top down in exchange for being able to rent from that land. Since a judge can only arbitrate a case in the community with the proprietor's approval for them to enter that society, and people generally want a dispute to be ruled in their favor, when a dispute against the proprietor may arise, the proprietor has both the incentive and the authority to allow in judges that would be biased towards them. This conflict of interest inevitably leads to a monopoly on arbitration, in other words, a state, all the while being 100% consistent with property ethics. Since a paleoconservative social order has a monopoly on anarchist social organization according to Hoppe, it means for him, an anarchist social order is impossible. 4. Cultural centralization. Culture is the sum of human action in a society and reflect the economics of the environment. Strict traditionalism that discourages risk and experimentation were useful when risk and experimentation meant death, but nowadays we can literally afford that kind of experimentation, and given we both agree a stateless society would be prosperous beyond our wildest dreams, this will be manifold the case in the absence of a government. There is no justification for the kind of puritanical moral busybodiness Hoppe argues is essential to maintain a libertarian social order that doesn't appeal to circular reasoning, and any interference in experimentation, provided the experiment doesn't actually threaten anyone, would simply be an infringement on other people's self-ownership. Cultural preferences are just that, preferences, and preferences are not principles. Paleo-libertarianism and other forms of neo-reactionary pseudo-libertarianism do not have a monopoly on a successful anarchist society, so knock it off! The problem that covenant communities are advocated for to solve doesn't exist. 5. Economic centralization. If a covenant community's proprietor can exercise the discrimination principle to create a monopoly on arbitration, why could they not use it on any other good or service? If they produce, say, wine, why wouldn't they be tempted to use their domination to exclude other wine vendors or producers to give themselves a territorial monopoly on wine, or even mandate that their residents purchase their wine regularly as a condition for renting? Substitute wine for any good or service. The extent to which this infringes on freedom of movement and freedom of association need not be explained, as the violation to the renter's self-ownership should be clear. The only reason this point, 3 and 4, are possible is because of 6. Proprietarianism. Any ethics that hold property rights above self-ownership conflict with natural law and makes just the command by the apartment owner in the flagpole problem for you to die. Property derives from self-ownership, not vice versa, and one can no more command someone to die than they can legitimately encircle someone's property with their own. Murder doesn't stop being murder just because I own the gun and I claim you stole the bullet from me and are holding it in your heart. It is entirely possible for property to be used in an aggressive manner, and failure to recognize this will simply lead to the very predation we seek to avoid as anarchists. Predation where people can be coerced into signing contracts they otherwise wouldn't, that enables unilateral, parasitic relations like that between citizens and their governments to exist. Proprietarian property ethics makes valid the criticisms leveled against property rights advocates, and limits libertarianism's explanatory power and universal appeal. 7. Structuralism. Structuralism is an analytical framework of social relations that examines structures, how they came about, and how they influence the behavior of people in society. However, when one examines society and social relationships from a structuralist framework, they lose the ability to conceive of social organization, order, or even rights as anything except a framework that was imposed from the top down. This is the premise upon which all of Hoppe's ideas rest upon. His centralization of society in the hands of the committed community is designed to satisfy both his preference for social order and his preference against statism simultaneously. The problem is that structuralism has made Hoppe incapable of conceiving of social order or natural law as a spontaneous phenomenon of moral agents acting in their individual self-interest. Instead, order and rights need to be imposed on a society by decentralized central planners voluntarily enslaving people into freedom prisons called covenant communities. 8. Recognize feudalism for what it is. Revisionist history is very useful, as it provides an alternative way to understand historical events in ways that provide more explanatory power. Sure, there are plenty of vested interests that wanted and still want to make feudalism appear worse than it actually was, and we should have humility in our judgments of the past. Feudalism was very useful in the economic situation of medieval Europe. Ethical? Of course not, but humanity did survive. However, the assumption that feudalism was a bottom-up, spontaneous phenomenon, as is asserted in From Aristocracy to Monarchy to Democracy, is simply unfounded, and modeling one's ideal of an anarchist social order around it is not only troubling from a marketing standpoint, but also entirely contrary to the principles of anarchism in its total rejection of political rule. Feudal societies were states, geographic monopolies on arbitration, maintained through violence and coercion. This social order came about because it was, better than marauding games of cataphracts, raping and pillaging and murdering with impunity. However, let's not pretend that the feudalist model is even remotely desirable in a future characterized by decentralization. 9. The state of unnature. Many of Hoppe's ideas are predicated upon the premise of being natural. Social conservatism is natural, you see. People will just know what is natural and what is not, and will be intuitively repulsed by behaviors and norms that are unnatural. The state of nature being a natural order ruled over without rulers by the king-not-kings of the natural aristocracy, maintained by a mutual incentive all participants have to keep their property rights, that is to say, the property rights of the proprietor. Yet Hoppe lacks any causal explanation for how a so-called natural order degenerated into a state, let alone an ability to explain what incentives were in place that enabled such degeneration in the first place. If he did so, he would be forced to admit that people would not organize into top-down, centrally planned authoritarian hierarchies voluntarily. The fact that the entirety of Hoppeanism is conscripted in service to ideas whose only justification is the appeal to nature fallacy, lacking any evidence or reason to support it, should have been the first hint that something was terribly wrong in Hoppe's methodology. A natural order that is so fragile, someone making an argument for voting is an existential threat to it. 10. Reject political action. Politics is the science of distributing scarce resources through victimization of others. By attempting to control politics, either through secessionism or participating in democracy, one not only fails to prevent victimization, but outright utilizes it. The methodologies for using political action are designed by the state, and they would never allow you to run for office or vote or even secede if there was a risk you could actually change anything fundamentally about the ruling class's relationship with their tax cattle. Many politicians throughout the West have won political office on the platform of even just reducing the extent of victimization by the state, so the question is hardly if people would ever vote for so-called limited government candidates. But what freedoms have been clawed back from the state's inexorable expansion into our lives? What liberties have been preserved? Even if we ignored the practical problem of voting, seeking political means for anti-political ends is a performative contradiction, as I've said several times, and Hoppe is a hypocrite for simultaneously arguing that democracy is an infringement on private property and demanding democratic participation. All voting accomplishes is enable murderers in suits called politicians to claim they have a mandate for the criminality. Voting gives your consent to the state to be victimized, preyed upon, controlled, and coerced. There is nothing pragmatic about making your interests only possible through the state. One need only consider what the state and state-controlled media and big tech is pushing this close to the 2020 election at the time of this recording. If voting were so subversive, why would our rulers want us to? If state eradication is the goal, new methodologies ought to be explored. My first recommendation? Subverting the state's ability to tax and regulate through counter-economic activity. Number 11. You will not be the natural aristocracy, so cut it out! From listening to Hoppians attempting to defend the object of worship in their little cult of personality, to all the equivocation, vague, unfalsifiable language, constant and pervasive contradictions, and redefining of uncontroversial aspects of Hoppe himself, I genuinely cannot regard Hoppianism as a libertarian philosophy. It's a subversive, statist philosophy antagonistic to the ends Hoppe claims to advocate for. Are Hoppe or Hoppians anarchists? Are they a proponent for the philosophy of no rulers? Of course not. Hoppians' only problem with rulers is that they're public rulers, not private rulers. Even then, their status as private rulers is only accomplished through trickery and wordplay. For want of a better term, Hoppianism is right-wing Marxism. It's just another form of authoritarian collectivism. Flirtation with social domination by monopoly rule is a pervasive and persistent aspect of an allegedly libertarian thought, being hugely complementary of monarchies, dictatorships, and the victimization of peaceful people through government violence, all the way to Hoppe himself outright advocating for child abuse, slavery, and murder of political opponents. If you watched our essay up to this point, then at least you are aware of the structural flaws in Hoppe's philosophy that lead anarchists into accepting and even promoting statism. Both Hoppians and libertarians need to reflect on what libertarianism actually means. That people who unironically advocate for spanking, using government violence against peaceful people, and even killing people because they find their opinions threatening, are unironically associated with libertarianism should have been the first clue that something was terribly wrong. Years ago. Why has this only just now been seriously challenged?
A good place to start, and this is actually an issue I see pervasive in just about all discussions about philosophy and mainstream discourse, so this doesn't just apply to libertarianism, is to have a more fleshed out understanding of what a conclusion is within the structure of your argument. So, to say that you're anti-government, anti-political authority, pro-property, a natural rights theorist, or even a libertarian is almost completely meaningless unless you can explain how you came to these conclusions, and can explain why your conclusion is a necessary product of the arguments in reaching it, or what it even is that you argue, and can do so with axioms that explain more than competing axioms. Your conclusion cannot be the basis in and of itself for explaining what it is that you argue, because that would mean that conclusions aren't dependent upon an explanation, which would mean that your conclusion is entirely arbitrary, since it's not dependent on any coherent axioms or principles used to explain it. In other words, if someone refers to themselves as a libertarian or a natural rights theorist, but what they're arguing conflicts fundamentally with libertarianism or natural law theories, then they're not libertarians or natural rights theorists. The fact that they call themselves libertarians or natural rights theorists is completely irrelevant because their actual positions can't possibly provide grounds to make these conclusions upon. If their framework is rhetorically structured in a way to make it so it's impossible to base these conclusions upon the verification of the logical consistency of axioms or principles used to reach them, then these worldviews can't explain anything, which renders them totally inept at even trying to make claims about nature in the first place, so for either reason they should be disregarded. Now, on to some other notes. When it comes to the subject of social cohesion, which Hoppians point to as being the main reason why covenant communities, as Hoppe describes them, are necessary, I think that the image which comes to mind that they project onto Hoppe's work is that of the relationship between someone who plants a tree with the intention of the tree being used for a specific intended purpose for the posterior, and the people who that person planted the tree for, which Lysander Spooner wrote about in No Treason.
So when a man says he is planting a tree for himself and his posterity, he does not mean to be understood as saying that he has any thought of compelling them, nor is it to be inferred that he is such a simpleton as to imagine that he has any right or power to compel them to eat the fruit. So far as they are concerned, he only means to say that his hopes and motives in planting the tree are that its fruit may be agreeable to them. So it was with those who originally adopted the Constitution. Whatever may have been their personal intentions, the legal meaning of their language, so far as their posterity was concerned, simply was that their hopes and motives in entering into the agreement were that it might prove useful and acceptable to their posterity, that it might promote their union, safety, tranquility, and welfare, and that it might tend to secure to them the blessings of liberty. The language does not assert, nor at all imply, any right, power, or disposition on the part of the original parties to the agreement to compel their posterity to live under it. If they had intended to bind their posterity to live under it, they should have said that their object was not to secure to them the blessings of liberty, but to make slaves of them, for if their posterity are bound to live under it, they are nothing less than the slaves of their foolish, tyrannical, and dead grandfathers.
The reason I mentioned this in this section and didn't when we were discussing covenant communities as a concept is because I want to make it as clear as possible that neither Heretic or I are suggesting that it's somehow unethical to establish an organization through non-coercive means which functions around policies deliberately structured in the aim of allowing members to make it less difficult for them or others to profit around types of associations which they might not otherwise find as easy, for instance, agreeing to have someone paint your house if you mow your lawn. The difference, of course, between this and what Hoppians are talking about when they refer to covenant communities is that the so-called community covenant doesn't own your land and the land of every other person in advance and declare that they own this land around a totally unilateral and actively aggressive basis which you have no ability to contest, effectively affording them a monopoly on every service in a given area. This is because, if you were to go back to the example Lysander Spooner provided of someone planting a tree with whatever intended purpose person who planted said tree had for people using it later on being taken into consideration, that doesn't entitle the person who planted the tree to claim other people have to use his tree, or that he can generally make claims of proprietorship about how other people associate just because he planted a tree, and that was precisely Spooner's point in context. Because this would be using force in an active context against someone else, making it a form of trespass against their property and/or bodily autonomy.
So, what's the problem with Hoppianism? It friggin' sucked!